The day I found my personal belongings moved to a desk outside my husband's office, I knew our marriage wasn't the only thing falling apart. The nameplate that once read Sarah Williams, CFO, had been replaced with Executive Assistant to the Tao. So, my husband had demoted me to his secretary in the company my father built, the company where I secretly held 51% ownership. He thought he was teaching me my place. Instead, he was signing his own professional death warrant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never planned on being the villain in my husband's success story. Most days, I still can't believe how quickly everything unraveled. One moment I was helping to run a $22 million architecture firm as chief financial officer, and the next, I was being asked to schedule my husband's lunch meetings and pick up his dry cleaning. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Sarah Williams. At 38, I should be in my professional prime, and until 6 months ago I was. Williams & Mitchell Design wasn't just a company to me. It was my birthright, my passion, and the physical manifestation of my father's dreams. Our headquarters in downtown Chicago stood as a testament to everything Robert Williams believed in: sustainable architecture, community-focused design, and creating spaces that served people rather than simply housing them. The glass and reclaimed wood building had been Dad's final project before his semi-retirement. Its open floor plan, living walls, and abundant natural light reflected his philosophy. That good design should nurture the human spirit. I spent my childhood running through construction sites with him on weekends, learning about load-bearing walls and environmental impact long before I understood algebra. By the time I earned my MBA, working alongside him wasn't just an option, it was the only future I could imagine. Dad fostered that sense of purpose in me. After Mom died during my sophomore year of college, he became my entire family. I rushed through my grief to be strong for him, graduating early to join the firm that had always been meant for both of us. We were a team, Dad and I, him with the creative vision, me with the financial acumen to make his dreams sustainable. He used to joke that I was the anchor that kept him from floating away on clouds of architectural possibility. Without you, he'd say over our Friday evening ritual of takeout Chinese food at the office, this place would be designing beautiful buildings that no one could afford to build. Those Friday nights were sacred. Just the two of us surrounded by blueprints and balance sheets, planning the company's future between bites of Kung Pao chicken. It was during one of those evenings that he first mentioned Mike Mitchell. "I interviewed a young architect today," Dad said, reaching for the last egg roll. Reminds me a bit of myself at that age. Hungry, innovative, not afraid to challenge convention. I remember rolling my eyes good-naturedly. "You say that about every new hire under 40. Dad smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that way that had deepened since Mom died. "This one's different. He's got something special. Vision, talent, and that rare quality where he actually listens before speaking." He tapped his chopsticks thoughtfully against his container. "He's also single." "Dad," I groaned. "We've talked about this. I don't need you playing matchmaker." "Who said anything about matchmaking?" he asked innocently. "I'm merely mentioning a demographic fact about our new senior architect. The fact that you're also unattached is pure coincidence." I changed the subject, but the truth was, I was lonely. At 30, I'd built a career I was proud of, but my personal life consisted of occasional dates that went nowhere and friendships maintained primarily through text messages. When Mike Mitchell walked into our office the following Monday, I understood my father's interest immediately. Mike stood out among our staff of 50-something project managers and earnest architectural interns. Tall, with thoughtful brown eyes, and a confidence that never tipped into arrogance, he moved through the office like he already belonged there. When Dad introduced us, Mike held my gaze a beat longer than necessary. "The famous Sarah," he said, shaking my hand firmly. Your father speaks highly of you, says you're the reason this place runs. He exaggerates, I replied, trying to ignore the warmth spreading through my chest. I doubt that, Mike said, and something in his tone made me believe him. Our courtship was almost embarrassingly traditional. Coffee after work became dinner the following weekend, which led to gallery openings and architecture tours where we debated the merits of different design philosophies. Mike was brilliant, not just technically skilled, but passionate about the social impact of architecture. He talked about sustainable urban planning and affordable housing with the same intensity Dad had always had. 3 months after his hiring, we were officially dating. 6 months in, he was regularly joining Dad and me for our Friday night planning sessions. By our 1-year anniversary, the 3 of us had developed a shorthand that made board meetings run smoother and creative decisions easier. Mike never tried to come between Dad and me. Instead, he created a triangle where each point strengthened the others. "He's good for you," my best friend Jessica said during a rare girls' night out, 2 years into my relationship with Mike. "You're less uptight since he came along." I laughed, relaxed from the wine and the relief of an evening without spreadsheets. "Is that a compliment or an insult?" "Observation," she corrected, signaling the bartender for another round. "But I still wonder sometimes." "Wonder what?" I prompted when she didn't continue. Jessica swirled her wine thoughtfully. "If he'd be here if your last name wasn't on the building." The comment stung more than it should have. "That's not fair, Jess. Mike has his own career. He was being recruited by firms in New York before Dad hired him." She didn't sound convinced. "Just watch how he looks at you when you're talking versus how he looks at you when your dad is talking about the future of the company. There's a difference." "He looks at me with love," I insisted, "and he looks at Dad with admiration. That's normal." Jessica shrugged. "If you say so. But he looks at the firm with hunger, Sarah. Just be careful. Some men want partners. Others want trophies and ladders." I dismissed her concerns as projection from her own bitter divorce. Jessica had married her college sweetheart, only to discover he'd been strategically building her up to take over her family's restaurant chain. Once he had enough power within the company, he filed for divorce and tried to push her out entirely. She'd kept her ownership through a brutal legal battle, but the experience had left her wary of ambitious men with charming smiles. Mike wasn't like that. He proved it when he proposed on our 3rd anniversary, not with a flashy diamond, but with blueprints for our future home. A modern take on a prairie-style house with sustainable features and room for a family. He'd designed every detail around my preferences. A home office with morning light, bookshelves built into unexpected corners, even a reading nook reminiscent of the one in my childhood home. "I want to build a life with you," he said as I traced the lines of what could be our future. "Not just a house, but a legacy." Dad was thrilled when we told him. He embraced Mike with genuine affection, calling him son for the first time. That night, after Mike left to meet friends for a celebratory drink, Dad poured us both a rare scotch from the bottle he kept for special occasions. "I couldn't have chosen better for you," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "He's got vision." "Sarah, but remember, vision without ethics is just ambition." I nodded, not fully processing the warning in his words, too caught up in the warmth of his approval and my own happiness. Our wedding was small but elegant, a celebration at the Chicago Botanic Garden with close friends and industry colleagues. Dad walked me down the aisle, whispering, "I'm so proud of you," before placing my hand in Mike's. I'd never seen him look so content. Marriage changed our dynamic at work in subtle ways. Mike and I were now a unit, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, though I kept Williams professionally for continuity. Clients sometimes assumed Mike was related to Dad by blood rather than law, a misconception neither of us corrected. Why explain that he'd married into the family when his talent spoke for itself? The early years of our marriage coincided with the firm's most successful period. We expanded from Chicago into Milwaukee and Indianapolis, growing from 30 employees to nearly 100. Our projects won sustainability awards and community impact recognitions. Dad began receiving Lifetime Achievement nominations, giving speeches where he increasingly cited Mike's influence alongside mine. In those speeches, Dad always emphasized the importance of our company culture. Williams & Mitchell isn't successful because of fancy designs or clever financing, he'd say. We're successful because we've created a family. Every person from our receptionist to our senior architects knows they matter. It was true. Linda, our HR director, had known me since I was a teenager visiting Dad's office after school. She'd been the one to help me pick out an appropriate black dress for Mom's funeral when I was too numb to make decisions. Kevin, our senior project manager, had taught me how to read blueprints before I had my driver's license. He still called me kiddo, despite me being his boss. Then there was Paul, Dad's oldest friend and our legal counsel. He'd been with the firm since it consisted of Dad and a drafting table in a rented room. As my godfather, he'd attended every major milestone in my life. His concerned expression whenever Mike and I disagreed in meetings should have been another warning sign. But I interpreted it as protectiveness rather than genuine concern. The first real fracture appeared 5 years into our marriage. We were discussing the direction of the company during one of our executive team retreats, a weekend at a lodge in Wisconsin where we'd combine strategic planning with team building. We need to be more aggressive with expansion, Mike argued. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During our Saturday morning session, the sustainable market is getting crowded. We should diversify. By diversify, you mean what exactly? I asked, studying the projections he'd distributed. Luxury developments, high-end commercial properties. The margins are better, and we can scale faster. Dad frowned. Those projects often come at the expense of our community commitments. Our pro bono work for affordable housing isn't just charity, it's part of our identity. Mike leaned forward, passionate but respectful. Robert, I admire that commitment. But what if we could do both? Build our commercial portfolio while using the increased revenue to fund even more impactful community projects? The room was divided. Greg Wilson, our sales director whom Mike had personally recruited, enthusiastically supported the idea. Natalie Parker from marketing, another of Mike's hires, was already sketching brand positioning notes. Paul and Kevin looked skeptical, while Linda watched the back and forth with visible concern. Dad eventually compromised, agreeing to a modest expansion into higher-end projects while maintaining our core focus. It seemed reasonable at the time, a natural evolution as we grew. Looking back, I recognize it as the first step in a calculated pivot. That same year, Dad began experiencing heart problems, the same condition that had taken Mom. Nothing critical at first, just concerning enough for his doctor to recommend reducing his workload. He started taking Fridays off, then Mondays as, well, gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations. I'm not getting any younger, he admitted reluctantly during a private lunch with me. And the firm needs fresh leadership for the future. We've been preparing for this, I assured him, hiding my worry behind pragmatism. I can take more off your plate until you're feeling better. Dad was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Actually, I've been thinking about a different approach. I'm considering appointing Mike as CEO starting next quarter. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Mike? Not me? Dad reached across the table to take my hand. Sarah, you're brilliant with numbers, with strategy, with making sure we're built on solid ground. But Mike has something special with clients, with the creative team. And I don't? My voice sounded small even to my own ears. It's not a competition, Dad said gently. You'll continue as CFO. Together, you'll lead this company into the future. His vision, your foundation, the perfect balance. I swallowed. My disappointment, telling myself this was a business decision, not a personal one. Dad wasn't choosing Mike over me. He was positioning each of us where we could contribute most effectively. Besides, Mike and I were a team, a partnership. His success was my success. That evening, I told Mike about Dad's decision. His reaction should have been another warning sign, the flash of triumph quickly masked by humble gratitude. He immediately began talking about necessary changes and fresh perspectives. "This is a huge responsibility," he said, pulling me into an embrace. "I won't let you or Robert down." "I know you won't," I replied, burying my face in his shoulder to hide my conflicted emotions. "We'll make him proud together." Dad made the announcement official the following week. The transition was scheduled to occur gradually over 3 months, with Mike assuming full CEO responsibilities just after the new year. But Dad never saw that new year. His heart condition worsened rapidly, a complication the doctors hadn't anticipated. He was hospitalized in early November, and despite the best medical care, he passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later. The funeral was beautiful in the way that all carefully planned tributes to extraordinary people are: elegant, tasteful, filled with stories of his vision and kindness. Colleagues, clients, and competitors alike came to pay their respects. Mike stood beside me throughout, his arms strong around my shoulders as I greeted mourners in a fog of grief. I was grateful for his stability, for the way he fielded questions, and managed logistical details when I couldn't form coherent sentences. The following days passed in a blur of legal meetings, client reassurances, and the surreal experience of returning to the office my father had built, knowing he would never walk through those doors again. Mike officially stepped into the CEO role, earlier than planned but necessary under the circumstances. I continued as CFO, though my focus was scattered by grief and the endless details of settling Dad's estate. The changes were subtle at first, almost imperceptible to someone still, numb from loss. Meetings scheduled during the therapy sessions Mike had encouraged me to book. Financial reports that reached my desk after decisions had already been made. My office, not Dad's, which Mike had immediately claimed, moved to a smaller space to consolidate the executive floor. "Just streamlining operations," Mike explained with a quick kiss on my cheek when I questioned the changes. "The firm needs a clearer chain of command now that Robert's gone." I wanted to believe him. Perhaps I needed to believe him, to have at least one pillar of my life remain stable while everything else crumbled. Maybe I was being oversensitive, seeing slights where there was only efficiency. Maybe this was just Mike's management style, different from Dad's, but not necessarily wrong. But as weeks passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Mike was systematically reducing my authority, limiting my access to information, and isolating me from decision-making. He began holding executive lunches on days I was meeting with clients. He formed a strategic planning committee that somehow never included me despite my role as CFO. Greg and Natalie had become Mike's closest advisors. The three of them often huddled in his office with the door closed. When I entered, their conversations would halt abruptly, resuming only after Mike nodded slightly, a signal I wasn't meant to notice. Linda caught my eye during one particularly tense staff meeting, her expression a mix of concern and something like pity. Later, she stopped by my office, closing the door carefully behind her. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" she asked, her voice low. "At home, I mean." The question startled me. "Yes, of course. Why?" She hesitated. "It's just the dynamic between you and Mike seems strained, and some of these organizational changes are unusual." I straightened papers on my desk, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "We're all adjusting to new leadership styles. Change is difficult, especially after losing Dad." Linda didn't look convinced, but she nodded. You know I'm always here if you need to talk about anything. I thanked her and turned the conversation to safer topics, but her concern lingered with me. That evening, I tried to discuss my feelings with Mike, approaching the subject carefully over dinner. I feel like I'm being sidelined at work, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Major decisions are happening without my input, even financial ones that should fall under my authority as CFO. Mike set down his fork, his expression a perfect blend of concern and slight confusion. That's not my intention at all, Sarah. I'm trying to protect you while you're grieving. You've seemed so fragile lately. Fragile? I've never missed a day of work, even right after Dad died. Being physically present isn't the same as being fully engaged, he countered gently. The firm needs steady leadership right now. I'm just doing what your father asked me to do. Lead. Dad meant for us to lead together, I insisted, feeling a flare of frustration. As partners. Mike reached across the table to take my hand, his touch warm and familiar. And we will. But right now, you need space to heal. And the company needs clarity. Trust me, Sarah. Haven't I always had your best interests at heart? The question hung between us, a test I wasn't sure how to evaluate anymore. I nodded finally, pushing aside the nagging doubt. This was Mike. My husband, my partner, the man who had stood beside me at my father's grave. Surely we could work through this transitional period. I had no idea how short that transition would be. 6 weeks after the funeral, I returned from a client meeting to find my office being emptied. My personal belongings, the family photos, the architectural awards, the framed picture of Dad and me breaking ground on our headquarters, had been boxed up. A maintenance worker was unscrewing my nameplate from the door. What's happening? I demanded, my voice sharp with shock. The worker looked uncomfortable. Just following orders, Mrs. Mitchell. Your new workspace is ready. He gestured toward the outer office, specifically to a desk positioned directly outside the double doors of what had been my father's office and was now Mike's. A new nameplate sat on the desk. Executive Assistant to the CEO. My body went cold, a physical sensation of disbelief washing over me. I walked past the worker, straight into Mike's office without knocking. He was on a call but looked up at my entrance, his expression shifting from annoyance to practiced patience. Let me call you back, he said to whoever was on the line. He hung up and leaned back in my father's chair, the leather one I'd given Dad for his 60th birthday. Sarah, I was going to discuss this with you tonight. Discuss what exactly? My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Why my office is being dismantled. Why there's a secretary's desk with my name on it outside your door. Executive assistant? He corrected mildly. And yes, we're restructuring. Greg's taking over as CFO. You've been distracted since your father died. Completely understandable, but the company needs stability. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. You're removing me as CFO? Just like that? I thought this would take pressure off you while you're grieving, Mike continued, his tone reasonable, concerned, the voice of someone making a difficult but necessary decision. You can focus on supporting the executive team without the stress of financial oversight. You demoted me to your secretary without even discussing it? My hands were shaking now, anger beginning to cut through the shock. He finally met my eyes, his expression gentle but firm. Executive Assistant Sarah. And it's temporary. Probably. We'll see how things go. The careful addition of probably wasn't lost on me. This wasn't a temporary accommodation for my grief. This was a calculated removal, a clear message about where Mike saw my place in the company my father had built, the company that had been my professional home for nearly 15 years. I stood frozen, 1,000 responses running through my mind, but none making it to my lips. Part of me wanted to scream, to remind him whose name was on the building, to demand respect not just as his wife, but as a qualified executive with an MBA and a track record of financial success. Instead, I simply turned and walked out, past the desk that was apparently now mine, past Linda's horrified expression, past the curious glances of staff members pretending not to watch. I kept walking until I reached my car in the parking garage. Only then, in the privacy of the driver's seat, did I allow myself to break. Deep, heaving sobs that came from a place even deeper than grief. This was betrayal, humiliation, the rewriting of my professional identity without my consent. When the tears finally subsided, I sat quietly, watching the digital clock on my dashboard mark the passing minutes. Something my father had said years ago floated back to me. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Mike had shown me who he was. Now I needed to decide who I was going to be in response. That night, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by my father's personal papers, the ones Mike hadn't thought to ask about. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I wasn't just hurt or angry. I was calculating. Because Sarah Williams, daughter of Robert Williams, was many things. But a secretary to her own husband in her own company? That was something I would never be. The next morning, I called Paul, our legal counsel and my godfather. My finger hovered over his contact for several seconds before I pressed it. This call would change everything, and I knew it. "Sarah," he answered warmly on the second ring. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" I skipped the pleasantries. "I need to understand something," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "The ownership structure of the firm. What exactly did Dad leave me?" There was a pause, longer than a normal conversational beat. "He didn't tell you?" Paul finally asked, his tone careful. "Tell me what?" Another pause. I could almost see Paul leaning back in his chair, the way he did when approaching a delicate legal matter. "Your father transferred 51% ownership to you 2 years ago. Mike owns 24% and the remaining 25% is distributed among senior staff. You've always been the majority shareholder." The phone nearly slipped from my suddenly numb fingers. "What? That's not possible. I would have known." "The paperwork was finalized right after your 36th birthday," Paul continued. "Robert wanted it done quietly. He said you two had discussed it." "We hadn't, at least not explicitly. Dad had mentioned estate planning and succession matters that he was handling with Paul, but I'd assumed it related to his retirement, not an immediate transfer of controlling interest." "Does Mike know this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I assumed he did," Paul said slowly. "But thinking back on his recent decisions, perhaps not." I thanked Paul and ended the call, then sat in perfect stillness, processing what this meant. My husband had demoted me in my own company, the company where I held controlling interest, and he had absolutely no idea. The rage I'd felt yesterday transformed into something colder, more calculated. I remembered my father's words. "Vision without ethics is just ambition." Mike had vision, certainly, but his ethics had been revealed the moment he thought he had. Unchecked power. I didn't confront Mike immediately. That would have been satisfying but short-sighted. Instead, I spent the day at my new assistant's desk, smiling placidly when Greg stopped by to awkwardly explain the new organizational structure. I nodded agreeably when Natalie outlined the communications plan for announcing my role change to clients. I even brought Mike coffee during his afternoon meeting with potential investors I'd previously flagged as concerning. That evening at home, Mike was cautiously affectionate, clearly expecting the confrontation I hadn't delivered at the office. When it didn't come, his relief was palpable. "I've been thinking," he said over dinner, refilling my wine glass with the expensive Cabernet he'd opened. "We should take a vacation soon. Just us. Maybe Cabo? You've been saying you needed beach time. I smiled, a practiced expression that never reached my eyes. That sounds nice. When were you thinking? Next month, maybe. After we finalize the Henderson development deal. Henderson Development. The luxury condo project Dad had rejected twice for their history of environmental violations. Interesting how quickly it had resurfaced in Mike's pipeline. Whatever. You think is best? I said mildly. You're the boss now, after all. He studied my face, searching for sarcasm or resentment, finding only pleasant accommodation. Sarah, about the restructuring, I hope you understand it's really what's best for the company right now. Of course, I replied. You need someone you can trust completely as your second in command. Greg's a logical choice. Mike relaxed visibly, clearly relieved to have navigated what he'd expected to be treacherous waters. Exactly. And honestly, you'll be happier with less pressure. You can focus on the parts of the business you enjoy without worrying about quarterly projections and investor calls. The condescension was breathtaking. 8 years of marriage, and he'd somehow convinced himself I found financial oversight burdensome rather than engaging, that I would prefer fetching coffee to steering fiscal strategy, that diminishing my professional contribution was somehow a gift. You know me so well, I murmured, raising my glass in a small toast. He clinked his against mine, completely missing the ice in my eyes. That night, as Mike slept beside me, I began planning. Not just an emotional response to betrayal, but a strategic assessment of my position and options. I had majority ownership. That was my most powerful asset. But wielding it effectively would require evidence, allies, and perfect timing. The next day, I started quietly gathering information. I retrieved the ownership documents from Paul and stored copies in a secure cloud account. I examined recent contracts, financial statements, board minutes, anything that might reveal the full scope of changes Mike was implementing. What I discovered made my blood run cold. It wasn't just my demotion. Mike had been systematically restructuring the entire company away from my father's vision. The Sustainable Design Division, my personal passion project, had been marked for efficiency review, a corporate euphemism for downsizing. The pro bono community projects Dad had always insisted on had been quietly canceled or indefinitely postponed. Most concerning, Mike had brought in his college friend as a strategic consultant who was being paid triple market rate for vague organizational development services. A quick background check revealed this friend had no relevant experience in architecture or business, but had recently purchased a vacation home in Aspen. I began documenting everything meticulously, building a file that would leave no room for misinterpretation. During the day, I played my role perfectly. The supportive wife and efficient assistant, diminished but accepting. I scheduled Mike's meetings, prepared his briefing materials, and nodded agreeably in discussions where I should have been a primary decision-maker. In the evenings, I continued my investigation, working from my home office after Mike had gone to bed. I reached out to trusted colleagues individually, careful never to reveal my full concerns, but asking pointed questions that helped complete my understanding of Mike's plans. Linda from HR confirmed my suspicions about staff morale, which had plummeted since my father's death. The old-timers are particularly worried, she confided during our lunch away from the office. There are rumors about an early retirement package being developed. Those old-timers were the heart of my father's company. Experienced professionals who had helped build Williams & Mitchell from the ground up. They were also the employees most dedicated to Dad's vision of architecture that served communities, not just profits. Kevin, our senior project manager, shared similar concerns when I ran into him accidentally at his favorite coffee shop. Something's off with the new project selections, he said, keeping his voice low though we were far from the office. Everything's shifting high-end, maximum profit margin. The kind of work your dad always said looked impressive in magazines but didn't actually improve people's lives. These conversations reinforced what I was seeing in the numbers. Mike wasn't just changing leadership. He was fundamentally altering the company's direction, priorities, and culture. The firm my father had built to create practical, sustainable spaces for diverse communities was being transformed into a profit-focused machine for luxury developments. My research expanded beyond the company itself. I hired a private investigator to look into the background of the new investors Mike was courting so aggressively. The preliminary report confirmed my worst fears. These weren't the ethical, community-minded partners Dad had always insisted on. One had a history of cutting corners on building safety to maximize profits. Another had been sued multiple times for using substandard materials while marketing properties as premium quality. The most alarming, however, was a real estate conglomerate with ties to a state senator currently under federal investigation for corruption. This was exactly the type of business relationship my father had explicitly avoided. Connections that might generate short-term profits but create long-term ethical and legal exposure. Meanwhile, Mike became increasingly comfortable with his uncontested power. He started staying late at the office, scheduling last-minute dinners with clients that couldn't possibly be rescheduled. When he was home, he was distracted, often taking calls in our home office with the door closed. I didn't confront him about these changes. I simply noted them, adding to my growing understanding of who my husband truly was when he thought no one was watching. 3 weeks into my investigation, the private investigator delivered his final report. It included something I hadn't specifically requested, but which answered a question I hadn't dared to ask. Surveillance photos of Mike and Natalie entering a downtown hotel together in the middle of a workday. Additional images showed them leaving separately 2 hours later. I stared at the photos for a long time, feeling strangely calm. The betrayal in our marriage now had photographic evidence, but it felt almost secondary to the larger betrayal of my father's legacy. Still, it completed the picture of Mike's character in a way that nothing else could have. That same day, I discovered emails between Mike, Greg, and Natalie discussing a 5-year plan for the company, one that had never been presented to the board or to me. The plan outlined a gradual shift in focus, the sale of our sustainable design division to a competitor, and eventually taking the company public. Mike would emerge as the visionary who transformed a small family business into a corporate success. There was even language about unfortunate but necessary restructuring, corporate speak for firing the employees who remained loyal to my father's vision. The people who had been with us from the beginning, who had attended my college graduation and sent flowers when Dad died, were being discussed as expendable overhead. I printed these emails and added them to my growing file of evidence. Then, I called Paul again, this time requesting a meeting outside the office. We met at his country club the following morning, early enough that we'd have privacy in the nearly empty dining room. "I need your advice," I said after we'd ordered coffee. "As my lawyer, not just as my godfather." Paul nodded gravely. "I've been expecting this conversation." I slid a folder across the table. "These are Mike's plans for Williams and Mitchell, not the ones he's shared with the board, but the actual strategy he's implementing." Paul reviewed the document slowly, his expression darkening with each page. When he finished, he removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Sarah, this is concerning. Some of these investor relationships could create significant liability for the firm. And these personnel changes." He shook his head. "This isn't what your father built." "No," I agreed quietly. "It's not. The question is, what can I do about it, legally speaking?" Paul leaned forward. "As majority shareholder, you have considerable power. You could call for a vote of no confidence in current leadership. With your 51%, it would pass automatically. And the consequences? Mike would be removed as CEO, effective immediately. You could appoint an interim leader or take the position yourself. Given these documents, he tapped the folder. I think you'd have strong support from the board. The minority shareholders would likely back you once they understand what's happening. I considered this. And if it gets ugly? If Mike fights? Back. Paul's expression was grim but determined. Then we fight harder. Sarah, your father trusted you with his company because he knew you would protect what matters. Not just the profits or the prestige, but the principles. I nodded slowly, a plan crystallizing in my mind. I need a little more time, a little more evidence, and I need to approach this carefully. Of course. Just don't wait too long. Based on these documents, Mike is moving quickly. I thanked Paul and left with renewed purpose. Over the next week, I continued my dual existence. Outwardly, the demoted wife-turned-assistant. Privately, the majority shareholder building a case against the CEO. I chose the quarterly board meeting for my stand. All senior leadership would be present, including the project managers who'd been with Dad from the beginning. Mike had prepared a presentation on his new direction for the firm, the public version, sanitized of the more troubling details I'd uncovered. The morning of the meeting, I dressed with particular care. A tailored charcoal suit my father had always said projected authority, paired with the simple pearl necklace that had been my mother's. I prepared Mike's usual pre-meeting. Materials, including the presentation clicker he always forgot, and a briefing note on attendees he sometimes struggled to remember. You're being especially helpful today, he commented as we walked toward the conference room together. Just doing my job, I replied with a pleasant smile. That's what you wanted, right? He didn't detect the edge in my voice. He was too focused on the presentation, on the performance of leadership he'd been rehearsing since taking over. The boardroom filled quickly. Greg and Natalie arrived together, their body language carefully professional, though I now knew better. Kevin and Linda sat on the opposite side, their expressions guarded. Paul came last, meeting my eyes briefly as he took his seat. Mike stood at the head of the conference table, confident and charismatic as always. Good morning, everyone, he began. Thank you for joining our quarterly review. We've had a challenging transition period since Robert's passing, but Williams & Mitchell is now positioned for unprecedented growth under stronger, more focused leadership. I watched him from my seat near the door, the place he'd assigned me to take notes. I waited until he finished his introduction, advancing to his first slide about strategic repositioning. Before we continue, I said, standing up, I'd like to address the board in my capacity as majority shareholder. The room went silent. Mike's smile froze. Majority what? He asked, his voice suddenly tense. I walked to the table and placed a document in front of each board member, the ownership structure Paul had provided. As owner of 51% of Williams & Mitchell Design, I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in current leadership. Mike's face drained of color. This is ridiculous. Sarah, you're upset about the reorganization. This isn't about my job title, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. This is about ethics, vision, and honoring commitments. This company was built on principles you've systematically undermined. I distributed a second set of documents, a concise summary of my findings, including the questionable investors, the inflated consultant fees, the canceled community projects, and the planned layoffs of long-term employees. With each revelation, Mike's confident facade crumbled further. When I reached the evidence of his relationship with Natalie, I didn't share it with the whole board. Instead, I simply slid it across the table to him alone. His eyes widened as he recognized the hotel photographs. These decisions were made for the good of the company, he insisted, looking around for support. But even Greg and Natalie were staring at their folders, avoiding his eyes. A company you thought was yours, I said quietly. But it never was. Paul cleared his throat. As legal counsel, I confirm that Sarah Williams holds majority ownership of Williams & Mitchell Design. Her call for a vote of no confidence is procedurally appropriate and binding. All in favor? I asked, looking around the table. Every hand rose, even Greg's, after a moment of obvious calculation about which way the wind was blowing. Natalie kept her hands folded in her lap, but it didn't matter. The outcome was determined the moment I revealed my ownership stake. Motion passes, Paul announced formally. Mike Mitchell is removed as CEO of Williams & Mitchell Design, effective immediately. Mike stared at me, shock giving way to anger. You planned this, all of it, playing the dutiful wife while gathering evidence behind my back. I learned from the best, I replied evenly. You taught me everything about pretending to be someone you're not. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. This isn't over. We're still married. I have rights. We can discuss those privately, I cut in. But right now, I need you to leave this building. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. I'd arranged this detail in advance. 2 security guards waited. Outside the boardroom, alerted by a text from Linda at my signal. They entered now, professional but unmistakably present. Mike looked around the room one last time, searching for allies and finding none. The empire he thought he'd built was crumbling before his eyes, brick by carefully laid brick. You'll regret this, he said as he moved toward the door. All of you. When he was gone, I turned back to the board. I know this is unexpected and disruptive. I apologize for the dramatic approach, but I felt it was necessary given the circumstances. Kevin, who had known me since childhood, gave a small smile. No apology necessary, kiddo. It's about time. What happens now? Greg asked, his tone carefully neutral. His quick abandonment of Mike hadn't escaped my notice. Now, I said, taking the seat at the head of the table, my father's seat, we rebuild. I'll serve as interim CEO while we evaluate our options. Our first priority is reversing the most damaging changes of the past 6 months and reaffirming our commitment to the core values that built this company. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. Some of you may not share those values. If that's the case, I understand, and I will respect your decision to move on. But for those who believe in what Williams & Mitchell has always stood for, ethical design, community impact, and treating our people like family, I hope you'll stay and help restore what's been damaged. The meeting continued for another hour as we discussed immediate priorities and next steps. Greg offered his resignation, which I accepted, effective in 2 weeks to allow for transition. Natalie didn't offer hers, but the subtext was clear in her stiff posture and averted eyes. The formal letter appeared on my desk the following morning. As the meeting concluded, Linda approached me. That couldn't have been easy, she said quietly. Personally or professionally? It wasn't, I admitted, but it was necessary. What about at home? She asked delicately. I gave a small, sad smile. That's the next conversation. But some things can't be rebuilt once they're broken. Mike was waiting at our house when I arrived that evening, his expression a storm of anger and calculation. A half-packed suitcase lay open on our bed. You humiliated me, he said without preamble, in front of the entire board. You demoted me to your secretary in my own company, I replied calmly. Which was worse? He paced the bedroom, running, his hands through his hair. This is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. Like you fixed the company? By dismantling everything my father built? I was modernizing it, making it competitive. Robert was stuck in the past with his community. Projects and sustainable designs that barely broke even. And there it was. The final confirmation that Mike had never shared my father's vision or values. He'd simply performed alignment long enough to gain position and power. The divorce papers will be ready tomorrow, I said quietly. Paul's already drafting them. Mike froze. Divorce? Sarah, don't be rash. We can work through this. Like you worked through things with Natalie at the Langham Hotel? 3 times last month alone? His face registered shock, then rapidly cycled through denial, anger, and finally calculation. That was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. None of it meant anything, I agreed. Not your vows, not your promises to my father, not the values you pretended to share. It was all a means to an end. That's not fair. I built that company as much as you did. I brought in new clients, new direction, and you'll be compensated fairly in the settlement, I interrupted. The prenup we signed ensures that, but Williams and Mitchell stays with me. Non-negotiable. We'd signed the prenuptial agreement at my father's insistence. At the time, I'd been embarrassed by his precaution. Now, I was profoundly grateful for his foresight. Mike's expression hardened as he realized his position. You think you can run that company without me? You've been out of the real decision-making for months. I managed just fine before you arrived, I said. I'll manage even better now that I see clearly. The weeks that followed were challenging but clarifying. Mike moved out that night, taking only his clothes and personal items, another condition of our prenup. He didn't fight the divorce, perhaps realizing the evidence I had would make any court battle even more damaging to his reputation. The settlement was finalized quickly, cleanly. Mike received the compensation outlined in our agreement. Generous, but far less than he would have walked away with had his plans succeeded. He left Chicago within a month, reportedly taking a position with a firm in Denver. At the company, the rebuilding process was more complex but equally decisive. I stepped into the CEO role not as an interim measure but as a permanent commitment. We rehired several talented architects Mike had pushed out, reinstated our community project division, and implemented the profit-sharing program my father had always envisioned but never formalized. Within 6 months, staff morale had rebounded. Within a year, our revenues had actually increased by 18%, disproving Mike's theory that ethics and profitability were mutually exclusive. We won a major contract to design a carbon-neutral university campus, exactly the kind of innovative, meaningful project my father would have championed. I kept the nameplate Mike had given me, executive assistant to the CEO, sitting on a shelf in my new office as a reminder, not of betrayal, but of underestimation and how dangerous it can be to mistake someone's quiet strength for weakness. On the anniversary of my father's death, I visited his grave alone, bringing the blueprints for our newest community project, affordable housing for veterans, built with sustainable materials and powered entirely by renewable energy. We're still on course, Dad, I said, placing a stone on his headstone in the Jewish tradition he'd always observed, though he wasn't religious. The vision is intact, and I finally understand what you meant about ethics and ambition. As I stood to leave, I felt a strange sense of peace replacing the grief that had dominated the past year. My father hadn't just left me a company. He'd left me the tools to protect it, the wisdom to guide it, and the strength to fight for it when necessary. Sometimes I think about what Mike lost through his betrayal. Not just the position or the prestige, but the chance to be part of something meaningful, something built on more than ambition. As for me, I no longer need to prove my worth to anyone. I know exactly what I bring to the table, and I make sure there's always room for others who share the values this company was built on. Because the greatest leadership isn't about controlling others. It's about creating something so valuable that others want to protect it as much as you do. 3 years after reclaiming Williams and Mitchell Design, I stood at the podium accepting the Urban Sustainability Award for our veteran housing project. The applause from the audience of industry leaders and community advocates washed over me like a cleansing wave. This moment, this recognition, wasn't just for me. It was vindication of everything my father had believed in, everything Mike had tried to dismantle. Architecture isn't just about buildings, I said into the microphone, the words coming easily after months of proving them through action, rather. than rhetoric. It's about creating spaces where communities can thrive, where sustainability isn't just a buzzword, but a foundational principle. This award belongs to every person at Williams & Mitchell who refused to compromise those values, even when it would have been easier to do so. From the stage, I could see Linda and Kevin at our company table, their proud smiles reflecting the journey we'd shared. The path from that confrontational board meeting to this moment of industry recognition hadn't been straight or simple. We'd faced challenges, financial pressures, skeptical clients, the whispered rumors Mike had spread before leaving Chicago. But tonight felt like confirmation that we'd made the right choices, honored the right priorities. After the ceremony, as we celebrated with champagne back at the hotel, Linda pulled me aside. "Robert would be bursting with pride right now," she said, squeezing my hand. "You didn't just save his company, Sarah. You've taken it further than even he might have imagined." The compliment warmed me, but I shook my head slightly. "I had an advantage Dad never did." "What's that?" "I saw exactly what happens when profit becomes more important than purpose," I replied. "Sometimes you need to glimpse the wrong path to fully commit to the right one." Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed since my confrontation with Mike. The company had transformed, certainly. We were now recognized leaders in sustainable urban architecture, our client list stronger than ever. But the most profound changes had happened within me. The divorce had been finalized quickly, Mike accepting the terms of our prenuptial agreement once he realized how thoroughly I'd documented his affair with Natalie. He'd moved to Denver as planned, joining a commercial real estate development firm. I heard occasionally about his projects through industry channels, luxury condos, upscale shopping centers, nothing that would ever win the kind of award we'd receive tonight. He'd gotten exactly the career he wanted, just not the company he thought he could take from me. My personal life had evolved more slowly, deliberately. I'd sold our house, the place we'd lived as husband and wife, unable to separate it from memories of betrayal. Instead, I'd purchased a loft in one of my father's early restoration projects, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and enormous windows that flooded the space with light. It felt like living inside one of Dad's dreams, and I found comfort in that connection. Dating had been complicated. For the first year after the divorce, I'd avoided it entirely, focusing instead on rebuilding the company and my own sense of trust. When I finally agreed to dinner with an architect from a friendly firm, I'd spent most of the evening analyzing his every comment for hidden motives or manipulation. It wasn't fair to him, and I recognized it wasn't healthy for me either. Instead of continuing to date before I was ready, I invested in therapy, weekly sessions with Dr. Meredith Collins, who specialized in betrayal trauma and rebuilding trust. Our conversations helped me understand how Mike's deception had affected me, not just professionally but personally, how it had shaken my confidence in my own judgment. "You didn't miss the signs because you were blind," Dr. Collins had told me during one particularly difficult session. "You missed them because you were operating under a fundamental assumption of good faith. That's not naivety, Sarah. That's humanity." Those words had been a turning point for me. Permission to forgive myself without excusing Mike's actions. I began to separate the betrayal from my self-worth, to understand that his choices reflected his character, not my value. As I worked through these personal challenges, the company continued to flourish under my leadership. We'd expanded thoughtfully, opening a second office in Milwaukee to better serve our growing client base in Wisconsin. We'd launched an internship program focused on recruiting diverse talent from state schools and community colleges, places often overlooked by prestigious firms that targeted only Ivy League graduates. The highlight of our recent projects was Renaissance Commons, the veterans' housing development that had won tonight's award. More than just apartments, it was a comprehensive community with shared gardens, a health clinic, job training facilities, and common spaces designed to foster connection and support. We'd work directly with veteran groups throughout the design process, incorporating their needs and feedback rather than imposing our vision. The project had been financially viable thanks to innovative funding approaches, a combination of tax credits, grants, and private investment we'd secured through persistent advocacy and creative financing. It was exactly the kind of work Mike had dismissed as impractical idealism, yet here we were, receiving industry-wide recognition for its success. My phone buzzed with a text, pulling me from my reflections. It was from James Chen, the structural engineer who had been instrumental in making Renaissance Commons both sustainable and affordable. Over the past year, our professional collaboration had gradually evolved into something more personal. Dinners that extended long past discussion of load-bearing walls, weekend hikes where we talked about everything except work. "Congratulations. Again," his message read. "Very proud of you and the team. Breakfast tomorrow before your flight?" I smiled as I typed my reply. Unlike Mike, James had his own established career, a respected engineering firm with values that aligned naturally. With Williams and Mitchell, he had nothing to gain from our relationship except the relationship itself, a fact that had slowly helped me rebuild my capacity for trust. Morning came early, sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains I'd forgotten to close. I dressed casually, for breakfast, leaving the corporate attire and polished persona of last night's ceremony behind. James was already waiting in the hotel restaurant, a newspaper open beside his coffee. "There she is," he said, standing to greet me with a warm hug. "The award-winning CEO." "The team-winning CEO," I corrected, sliding into the seat across from him. No one person could have pulled off Renaissance Commons. "True," he agreed, pouring me coffee from the carafe on the table. "But not everyone would have championed it in the first place. Projects like that need advocates at the top." We chatted through breakfast about the ceremony, the contacts I'd made, potential collaborations that might emerge. James listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions without trying to direct the conversation. One of the qualities I'd come to appreciate most about him. As we finished our meal, he hesitated slightly before saying, "I got an interesting call yesterday, from Mike Mitchell." My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. "Mike called you? Why?" "He's working on a development in Boulder," James explained. "Looking for a structural engineer? Said he'd heard good things about my firm." The coincidence seemed too precise to be accident. "Did he know about us?" James shrugged. "Hard to say. He didn't mention you at all," which felt deliberate. I told him we're at capacity with current projects. I set my cup down carefully. "Thank you." For turning him down? I would have done that regardless. His project is exactly the kind of environmentally questionable development I avoid. "Not just for that," I said. "For telling me. For not keeping it as a little secret." James reached across the table to take my hand. Small secrets have a way of growing into big problems. I learned that lesson the hard way in my first marriage. His honesty was another quality that distinguished him from Mike. James spoke openly about his past relationship failures, what he'd learned from them, how they'd shaped his approach to our relationship. There was a transparency that made it easier to trust, to believe his words matched his intentions. Back in Chicago the next day, I returned to the office energized by the award recognition and clear about our next steps. The morning staff meeting had a celebratory atmosphere, though I was careful to emphasize that awards were affirmation, not destination. "We've proven our model works," I told the assembled team. "Now we need to make it replicable, scalable, accessible to more communities." After the meeting, Linda lingered behind. "There's something you should know," she said once the room had cleared. "Greg Wilson has been reaching out to some of our staff." Greg, Mike's chosen CFO who had quickly abandoned him when the power shifted. He'd landed at a competitor after leaving Williams and Mitchell, his loyalty evidently as transferable as his skills. Reaching out how? I asked. Recruitment calls, offering significant salary increases, especially to our younger designers, those who didn't know Robert personally. I nodded slowly, processing this new challenge. Have we lost anyone? Not yet, but Maya in Sustainable Systems and Derek from the urban planning team are considering offers. Both were talented professionals we'd invested in significantly, paying for advanced certifications, mentoring them through complex projects. Their departure would be a genuine loss. Set up meetings with each of them, I decided. Not to counteroffer immediately, but to understand what they're seeking. There might be growth opportunities or challenges they need that we haven't identified. Linda smiled approvingly. Already scheduled for this afternoon. And Linda, thank you for creating an environment where they'd tell you about these offers instead of just taking them. She shrugged. People stay where they feel valued, Sarah. That's always been true. My conversations with Maya and Derek proved illuminating. Money was a factor in their consideration of Greg's offers, certainly. Both were dealing with student loans and Chicago's rising cost of living. But equally important were their desires for greater project responsibility and clearer paths to leadership. I love our mission, Maya explained earnestly. The sustainability focus is why I joined Williams and Mitchell. But sometimes I feel like my ideas get filtered through 3 levels of approval before they're taken seriously. Derek nodded in agreement. The hierarchy here can be traditional, great for stability, but sometimes it feels like innovation is slower than it could be. Their feedback was valuable, a perspective I might have missed without the catalyst of Greg's recruitment efforts. It highlighted a potential blind spot in how we were developing our next generation of leaders. Rather than simply increasing their compensation, though that was part of the solution, I worked with Linda to create a new structure, innovation teams that would operate with greater autonomy, led by promising mid-career staff like Maya and Derek. These teams would have dedicated budgets for exploring new approaches, materials, and technologies, reporting directly to senior leadership, rather than through multiple management layers. Both chose to stay, energized by the opportunity to shape their professional paths while remaining aligned with our core values. Their decisions reinforced something my father had often said. People join companies, but they leave managers. Give them good reasons to stay beyond just a paycheck. The experience prompted a broader examination of our organizational structure. Over the next several months, we undertook a careful reevaluation of how decisions were made, how communication flowed, and how we were preparing for leadership succession throughout the company. This wasn't just about retention or preventing poaching from competitors. It was about ensuring Williams and Mitchell would remain true to its founding principles long after I was gone, that the values wouldn't leave with any single person, even me. One Tuesday morning, almost 4 years to the day since I'd confronted Mike in the boardroom, I received an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing site plans for a new mixed-income development when my assistant announced, "There's a Diane Mitchell here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment." Diane Mitchell, Mike's mother. We'd met only a handful of times during my marriage, always at holiday gatherings where she'd made little effort to connect with me or my father. She'd viewed the Williams family as Chicago new money, lacking the pedigree she prized despite her own financial struggles that Mike had occasionally mentioned. Curiosity overcame my initial wariness. "Send her in." Diane entered my office with the practiced poise of someone accustomed to commanding attention. At 60-something, she remained striking, silver hair perfectly styled, makeup impeccable, clothing expensive though perhaps from several seasons past. "Sarah," she said, her tone neither warm nor cold. "Thank you for seeing me." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "This is unexpected." She sat, arranging herself carefully. "I imagine so. We were never close. When you were married to Michael." The understatement almost made me smile. We'd been barely cordial, her disapproval of me evident beneath thin social veneer. "What brings you to Chicago?" I asked, choosing directness over small talk. "Michael is getting remarried," she said. "A lovely girl from a good Denver family. Banking background." I waited, unsure why this announcement warranted a personal visit. My divorce from Mike had been final for years. His romantic life was no longer relevant to mine. "I came across something while helping him organize some old papers," Diane continued, opening her handbag. "Something I thought might be important to you." She removed a folded document and placed it on my desk. I opened it cautiously, then froze as I recognized my father's handwriting. A letter addressed to Mike, dated 2 weeks before Dad's death. "Where did you get this?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. As I said, I was helping Michael prepare for his move to a new home with Caroline, his fiancée. "This was in a box of papers from your marriage. He likely forgot he had it." I scanned the letter, my heart pounding with each sentence. It was clearly written when Dad knew his time was limited, a private communication to the man he believed would carry forward his legacy alongside me. "I'm entrusting you with 2 precious things," Dad had written. "My company and my daughter. Honor them both by remembering that true success isn't measured in profit margins or industry rankings, but in lives improved and communities strengthened. Sarah understands this inherently. I hope you'll support her vision even when market pressures tempt you toward easier paths." The letter continued, outlining Dad's hopes for the company's future, expanding our community-focused work, developing younger architects who shared our values, maintaining the ethical standards that had defined Williams & Mitchell from its founding. "I've structured ownership to ensure Sarah will always have final authority," he wrote, "not because I doubt your capabilities, but because I believe 2 perspectives are stronger than one, and her moral compass has never wavered. Partner. With her truly, Mike. Listen to her wisdom. It will lead you both further than ambition alone ever could." The final paragraph was personal, from father-in-law to son-in-law. "Make her happy, Mike, not with material success or status, but with respect, partnership, and the kind of love that puts her needs alongside your own. That's the only request I make as her father." My eyes burned with unshed tears as I set the letter down. "He never saw this, did he?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Diane shook her head. "No, it was still sealed when I found it." The implications crashed over me. The letter delivered too late, perhaps intentionally intercepted. Would things have been different if Mike had read my father's words? Would they have given him pause before he began dismantling Dad's legacy and pushing me aside? "Why are you bringing this to me now?" I asked, studying Diane's composed face for clues to her motivation. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "Let's say I've had time to reflect. Michael is positioning his history with your firm differently in Denver, creating a narrative where he was the visionary limited by family tradition." "And you don't approve of the lie?" I asked, surprised. "I raised my son to believe appearance matters," she said carefully, "but there comes a point where revision becomes delusion, where stories we tell ourselves and others become too far removed from truth." I considered this unexpected glimpse of principle from a woman I'd always viewed as superficial and status-obsessed. "Thank you for bringing this to me," I said finally. "It means a great deal." She nodded once, standing to leave. At the door, she paused. "You've done well with the company, better than I would have anticipated." From Diane, this constituted effusive praise. "Thank you." The Veteran Housing Project, Renaissance Commons. My brother lived there briefly after his tour in Afghanistan, before he got back on his feet. Another pause. It made a difference. For him. With that surprising revelation, she left, her perfume lingering in the air along with the implications of what she'd shared. Not just the letter, but the personal connection to our work, a connection she'd chosen to acknowledge despite her complicated relationship with me and the company. I spent the rest of the day distracted, my father's words echoing in my mind. At 5, I told my assistant I was leaving early and drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. The early autumn air held the first hint of crispness as I sat beside his headstone, the letter in my hands. "I wish you'd told me about this," I said to the quiet presence I still felt when I visited. "About your concerns, your contingency plans. We could have faced it together." The breeze rustled through nearby trees, a sound that always reminded me of my father's thoughtful sighs when considering a complex problem. "But you did prepare me," I continued. "Not with warnings I might have dismissed, but with values I couldn't forget. With an ethical foundation strong enough to recognize wrong even when it was dressed as progress." I traced his name on the stone, the dates that encompassed his remarkable life. "The company is thriving, Dad. Not just financially, though we're doing well there too. We're making the kind of difference you always believed was possible. And I'm okay. Better than okay." I told him about James, about our careful, honest relationship built on mutual respect and shared values, about the innovation teams and how they were energizing our younger staff, about Linda's retirement plans and the thoughtful transition we were creating to preserve her institutional knowledge. As daylight faded, I folded the letter and placed it in my pocket. Some might have seen it as confirmation of betrayal. Further, evidence of Mike's deception, but I chose to receive it differently, as the final guidance from my father, arriving exactly when I was ready to hear it. The next morning, I called an unscheduled meeting with our senior leadership team. The letter had crystallized something I'd been considering for months but hadn't fully articulated. Williams and Mitchell has always been defined by its values. I began once everyone was seated in our conference room. My father built this company on principles of ethical design, community impact, and treating our people like family. Nods around the table, especially from those who had known Dad personally. As we continue to grow, we need to ensure those values remain at our core, not dependent on any single leader or generation, but embedded in our structure, our processes, our daily decisions. I outlined my proposal, a formal ethical framework that would guide everything from project selection to hiring practices, from vendor relationships to community engagement. Not just aspirational statements on our website, but practical guidelines with accountability measures and regular assessment. We'll call it the Robert Williams Legacy Standards, I explained. A living document that can evolve with changing times while preserving the fundamental principles that make this company what it is. The discussion that followed was passionate, engaged, exactly the kind of collaborative problem-solving my father had valued. By meeting's end, we had the outline of an approach and volunteers to develop each component. As we wrapped up, Kevin, now nearing his own retirement, caught my eye across the table. "Robert would have loved this," he said simply, taking implicit values and making them explicit for the next generation. His words warmed me, but I shook my head slightly. Dad created the values. I'm just building the structure to protect them. Kevin's smile was knowing. That's leadership, Sarah. Recognizing what needs to be preserved and finding new ways to ensure it endures. That evening, as I left the office, the city skyline glowed against the darkening sky. So many of those buildings had stories woven into my own. The museum extension that had been one of Dad's favorites, the library renovation where I'd first taken the lead, the affordable housing complex that had won us recognition when others said it couldn't be done profitably. Architecture, at its best, outlasts its creators. It becomes part of the urban fabric, shaping lives long after the architects and builders are gone. Perhaps companies were similar. The truly meaningful ones transcended their founders, carrying forward values and vision through evolving leadership. The thought brought me unexpected peace. Williams and Mitchell would never be just my father's company again, nor would it be solely mine. It would be something more enduring, a legacy of purpose passed from generation to generation, each adding their unique contribution while honoring the foundation. As I walked to my car, phone buzzing with a message from James about dinner plans, I felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a circle. The kind of perfect architectural symmetry my father had always appreciated. We had weathered betrayal, reclaimed purpose, and emerged stronger than before. The company had found its future. And so had I. 5 years to the day after taking back control of Williams and Mitchell Design, I stood in the gleaming lobby of our newest completed project, a mixed-use development that combined affordable housing, community spaces, and environmentally sustainable design in a way that had once seemed impossible. Sunlight streamed through the electrochromic glass ceiling, casting warm patterns across the reclaimed wood flooring, while residents and visitors moved through the space with the easy familiarity that marked truly successful architecture. Harmony. Heights doesn't feel like a statement building, noted the journalist walking beside me, her recorder capturing our conversation for an upcoming feature in Architectural Digest. It feels like it's always belonged here. I smiled, recognizing the highest compliment our work could receive. That's exactly what we aim for. Architecture shouldn't impose itself on a community. It should emerge from the community's needs and aspirations. We continued the tour, moving from the solar-powered central atrium to the rooftop gardens, where residents grew vegetables and herbs in raised beds designed for accessibility. Children played in a splash pad that doubled as a rainwater collection system, their laughter echoing across the space. Elderly residents chatted on shaded benches positioned to encourage conversation while offering respite from the summer heat. The intergenerational aspects are particularly striking, the journalist observed. Most developers would have segmented these populations. Most developers are solving for profit margins rather than human connection, I replied. We designed Harmony Heights based on research showing that both children and seniors benefit from regular interaction. The financial model followed the social mission, not the other way around. She nodded, making notes as we walked. Williams and Mitchell has become something of an industry outlier in that approach. Your contemporaries claim this level of community. Integration and sustainability isn't financially viable at scale. They said the same thing about Renaissance Commons, I reminded her, referencing our award-winning Veterans Housing Project. 5 years later, not only is it financially sustainable, but we've replicated the model in 3 additional cities. The problem isn't viability, it's imagination and patience. Most developers want quick returns rather than lasting impact. As we concluded the tour and said our goodbyes, Promise Jackson, our director of community engagement, approached with a group of architecture students from the local community college, participants in the internship program we'd established, to create pathways into the profession for underrepresented groups. Ms. Williams, Promise called, her voice warm with enthusiasm. Our summer cohort wanted to thank you personally before they finish their program next week. The students gathered around, eager but professional in their demeanor. I recognized several from my visits to their design charrettes throughout the summer. I should be thanking you, I told them. Your fresh perspectives have already influenced our approach to several upcoming projects. A young woman stepped forward slightly, Maya Johnson, whose redesign of a community clinic waiting area had particularly impressed our senior architects. We've been discussing something as a group, she said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. The Williams Fellowship. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Tell me more. A permanent fund to support students like us, Maya explained. Not just summer internships, but year-round mentorship, tuition assistance, professional development. We've drafted a proposal, added Thomas Reyes, another standout from the program. A structure that would become self-sustaining over time, with each generation of fellows eventually contributing to support the next. Promise handed me a professionally bound presentation. They developed this entirely on their own, outside their regular program responsibilities. As I flipped through the carefully prepared document, I felt a swell of emotion that caught me by surprise. This wasn't just a student project. It was a vision for extending our company's values beyond current projects into the very foundation of the profession itself. It embodied everything my father had believed about architecture as a vehicle for social good, about creating opportunity rather than hoarding advantage. "This is extraordinary," I said, meeting each student's eyes in turn. "I'd like to present this to our board next week. Would your group be willing to make the presentation yourselves?" Their surprised delight was answer enough, and as they departed, already discussing how they'd refine their proposal, I turned to Promise with a smile. "They remind me of someone." "You?" she suggested. I shook my head. "My father. That combination of practical idealism and methodical planning. He would have adored them." Promise nodded understanding. Though she'd joined Williams and Mitchell, after my father's passing, she'd absorbed enough of our company culture to recognize his ongoing influence. "Speaking of planning," she said, "are you ready for tomorrow?" Tomorrow, my wedding day. After 5 years of slowly rebuilding trust through my relationship with James Chen, we were finally making it official in a small ceremony at the Garfield Park Conservatory, surrounded by the greenery we both loved. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, unable to keep the smile from my voice. "Though I still have to finish my vows tonight." "You'll find the right words," Promise assured me. "You always do." That evening, I sat in the study of my loft, the space illuminated by the soft glow of my desk lamp as Chicago's skyline twinkled beyond the windows. James was staying at his own place tonight, a nod to tradition that had felt right to both of us, despite our thoroughly modern relationship. My laptop screen displayed a half-written document, attempt number 5 at wedding vows that would capture what this relationship meant to me without being shadowed by the past. I wanted to honor the journey that had brought us together without making tomorrow about anything except our shared future. A gentle knock at my door interrupted my contemplation. Checking the security camera from my phone, I was surprised to see Linda standing outside, a gift bag hanging from her wrist and a concerned expression on her face. "Linda?" I said as I opened the door. "Is everything okay?" She stepped inside, setting the bag on my counter. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to drop off your something old for tomorrow and..." She hesitated. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I should have shared years ago." We moved to my living room, Linda perching on the edge of the sofa while I took the adjacent armchair, curious and slightly concerned by her serious tone. "Do you remember that day?" she asked. "When you came back from the client meeting and found your things moved to the desk outside Mike's office?" How could I forget? It had been the catalyst for everything that followed. My discovery of majority ownership, the evidence gathering, the confrontation that had ultimately led to reclaiming my company and rebuilding my life. "Of course," I replied. Linda took a deep breath. I knew it was happening. The day before, I overheard Mike instructing maintenance to make the change. "I could have warned you." I blinked, surprised by this revelation. "Why didn't you?" Her eyes met mine directly. "Because I knew you needed to see it clearly. What he was capable of, how far he was willing to go. I'd watched him gradually, undermining you for months, always with plausible explanations that kept you questioning yourself rather than him." She reached for my hand. "If I'd warned you, you might have confronted him privately. He would have smoothed it over, maybe delayed his plans but not changed them. You needed the shock of that moment, the undeniable evidence of his true intentions." I sat back, absorbing this new perspective on a pivotal moment in my life. Linda had been at Williams and Mitchell since I was a teenager. She'd known me longer than almost anyone else in my professional life. Her decision hadn't been made lightly. "I've carried that choice with me for years," she continued, wondering if I should have acted differently. if I betrayed your trust by staying silent. You didn't, I said firmly, squeezing her hand. You gave me the clarity I needed at exactly the right moment. Without that shock, without seeing his actions so plainly, I might have continued making excuses, continued doubting my own perceptions. Relief softened her features. I hoped you'd see it that way. But still, I needed you to know before your wedding tomorrow. No more secrets, no more wondering. We talked a while longer, reminiscing about the company's evolution and her upcoming retirement. As she prepared to leave, she handed me the gift bag she'd brought. You're something old, she explained. For the wedding tradition. Inside, I found a small leather-bound portfolio I recognized immediately, the one my father had carried to every client meeting, containing sketches and notes from his earliest projects. I'd thought it lost in the office reorganization after his death. Where did you find this? I asked, running my fingers over the worn leather. I rescued it when Mike was clearing out your father's office, Linda admitted. Kept it safe until the right moment. It seemed fitting for tomorrow. After she left, I opened the portfolio carefully, feeling the connection to my father in the texture of the paper, the familiar strokes of his architectural renderings. Tucked in the back, I found a sketch I'd never seen before. A concept. Drawing for what appeared to be a house, with notes in my father's distinctive handwriting. For Sarah and future family, the margin note read, site options, Michigan lake property or Wisconsin woodland. The date in the corner revealed he'd drawn this just weeks before his diagnosis, a hopeful vision of my future he hadn't lived to share. The house design incorporated elements I'd always loved, abundant natural light, connection between indoor and outdoor spaces, sustainable features that were advanced even by today's standards. Tears welled in my eyes as I studied the details, my father's last gift, delivered at the perfect moment through Linda's thoughtfulness. It wasn't just a house design. It was his blessing for the future he wouldn't witness, his hope that I would find happiness beyond the company that had been our shared passion. Inspired by this unexpected connection, I returned to my laptop and finished my wedding vows, the words flowing more easily now. I wrote about building foundations strong enough to weather storms, about creating spaces where love could flourish, about the architecture of trust and how it's constructed through daily choices and consistent actions. The next morning dawned clear and perfect, one of those rare Chicago summer days with low humidity and brilliant sunshine. I dressed with the help of my closest friends, the simple ivory sheath dress reflecting the understated elegance James and I had chosen for our celebration. No pre-wedding jitters? Jessica asked as she helped secure my mother's pearl earrings, my something borrowed for the day. I shook my head, surprising myself with the complete absence of anxiety. Not a single one. This feels right in a way. I can't fully explain. Jessica smiled, adjusting my hair one final time. You don't need to explain it. It's written all over your face. The ceremony was everything we'd hoped for. Intimate, meaningful, focused on our commitment rather than spectacle. James's vows brought tears to my eyes with their sincere simplicity. I promise to build our life together with the same care and integrity I bring to my work. Solid foundations, thoughtful design, room to grow, and always with sustainability in mind. When it was my turn, I spoke from my heart about the journey that had brought us together. Not the pain or betrayal that preceded our meeting, but the openness and courage it had taken for both of us to try again, to believe in partnership after disappointment. Trust isn't blind faith, I said, holding his hands in mine. It's a structure. We build together, beam by beam, choice by choice. I promise to continue building with you, to create something beautiful and lasting, to make space for growth while honoring the foundation we've established. The reception that followed reflected our shared values: locally sourced food, minimal waste, meaningful conversation rather than lavish displays. We'd asked for donations to the newly established Williams Fellowship in lieu of gifts, a decision our guests had embraced wholeheartedly. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around us, James and I slipped away to a quiet corner of the conservatory. "Happy?" he asked, his arm warm around my waist. I leaned into him, contemplating the question. Happiness seemed too simple a word for the complex emotion filling me, a combination of contentment, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of having rebuilt something stronger from what had once been broken. "More than happy," I replied. "Whole." His smile told me he understood exactly what I meant. The following week, our focus returned to Williams & Mitchell and the continued evolution of the company. The board enthusiastically approved the Williams Fellowship after the students' compelling presentation, allocating initial funding and establishing a committee to refine implementation details. As we wrapped up the meeting, Paul, now semi-retired, but still serving as board chair, asked me to stay behind. When the room had cleared, he handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "An offer," he replied. "From Mitchell Development Group in Denver." I stared at the envelope, making no move to open it. "Mike wants to buy us out?" Paul nodded. He secured significant backing from investors impressed by his luxury developments. "The offer is substantial." I placed the envelope on the table, unopened. "Not interested." "Don't you want to at least review the terms?" "There's no number large enough to make me consider it," I said simply. "This company isn't for sale. Not to Mike, not to anyone." Paul smiled, seeming pleased with my response, though he tried to maintain his lawyer's neutrality. "I'll draft the appropriate refusal. But Sarah, he's likely to try again. His new development group is expanding aggressively, acquiring smaller firms throughout the region. Let him expand however he wants," I replied. "Williams & Mitchell will remain independent, committed to our values and vision." Later that day, curiosity got the better of me, and I finally opened Mike's offer letter. The number was indeed substantial, well above market value by conventional metrics. But the accompanying letter revealed his true motivation wasn't just acquisition of a successful competitor. "Reuniting our professional capabilities would benefit both organizations," he wrote. "Your community focus combined with our luxury market presence would create an unparalleled full-spectrum firm." Reading between the lines wasn't difficult. Mike had built a name for himself in high-end developments, but was finding his firm pigeonholed, unable to compete for the increasingly valuable sustainable community projects where Williams & Mitchell had established industry leadership. He wanted our reputation, our expertise, our project portfolio, the very elements he had once dismissed as impractical idealism. I drafted a personal response to accompany the formal rejection letter our SAWA legal team would prepare. "Thank you for your interest in Williams & Mitchell Design," I wrote. "While I appreciate the recognition of our firm's value, we must decline your offer. Our independence is fundamental to maintaining the vision and values that define our work. I wish you continued success with Mitchell Development Group and hope you find the fulfillment you're seeking in your chosen direction." Professional, courteous, and absolutely final. I signed it simply Sarah Williams, using my maiden name as I had professionally since our divorce. That evening, James and I reviewed my father's house sketches over dinner in our loft. Our honeymoon would wait until winter when we'd both completed current project commitments, but we'd begun discussing where we wanted to live long-term. The loft had served me well during my rebuilding years, but we both envisioned something different for our shared future. A home that would combine our complementary professional expertise and personal preferences. These are remarkably forward-thinking. For designs from 5 years ago, James noted, studying the sustainable systems my father had incorporated. The passive cooling approach could be enhanced with newer materials, but the concept is sound. I traced the flowing indoor-outdoor transitions that had been my father's signature. "What do you think about adapting these for the lake property?" We could maintain his vision while updating elements to reflect current technologies. James looked up with a warm smile. Building your father's final design as our home together? I can't imagine anything more perfect. The decision felt right, honoring the past while creating something new, much as we'd done with Williams and Mitchell itself. We spent the evening sketching modifications, blending James's structural expertise with my father's original concept and my own design sensibilities. The result was a true collaboration across time and relationships, a physical manifestation of continuity and growth. As summer transitioned to fall, Williams and Mitchell continued its own evolution. Linda's retirement after 30 years with the company marked the completion of a generational shift in leadership. While I remained as CEO, the senior team now consisted primarily of professionals who had joined after my father's passing. People committed to our values not from personal loyalty to Robert Williams, but because those principles aligned with their own vision of what architecture could and should be. This transition had been carefully planned and executed over years, ensuring the company culture would transcend any individual leader, even me. The Robert Williams legacy standards had become a living framework, regularly reviewed and refined, but unwavering in core commitments to ethical practice, community impact, and sustainable design. On Linda's last day, we gathered for a celebration that doubled as a groundbreaking ceremony for our newest project, an innovative climate resilience center that would serve vulnerable Chicago neighborhoods while demonstrating cutting-edge sustainable building techniques. Located on previously abandoned industrial land, the project embodied our commitment to revitalization without displacement. Standing at the podium to introduce Linda for her farewell remarks, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. When my father founded this firm, he established not just a business but a philosophy, I told the assembled crowd of employees, clients, and community partners. He believed architecture should serve people first, profit second. That buildings should enhance communities, not extract from them. That the measure of success isn't headlines or awards, but lives improved. I glanced at Linda, who had witnessed the company's entire history from my father's earliest days to our current position as industry leaders in sustainable community design. Some of you knew Robert Williams personally. Most of you now know him only through the values that still guide our work. Both perspectives are equally valuable. The personal connection to our founder and the fresh energy of those who joined us because our mission matched their own aspirations. As Linda approached the podium to thunderous applause, I stepped aside with profound gratitude, not just for her decades of service, but for the moment of clarity she had given me 5 years ago. That painful revelation of Mike's true intentions had been the catalyst for everything that followed. The reclamation of my company, the recommitment to my father's values, the personal growth that had ultimately led to finding authentic partnership with James. Linda's speech was characteristically modest, focused more on the company's future than her own contributions. As she concluded, she called me back to the podium for the groundbreaking, handing me a shovel with a knowing smile. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "Not just of what you saved, but of what you've built." The simple statement touched me deeply. I had spent years focused on preserving my father's legacy, protecting what he had created from those who would diminish or exploit it. But somewhere along the way, preservation had transformed into creation. Williams and Mitchell wasn't just my father's company anymore. It had become a living embodiment of his values expressed through new voices, new approaches, new generations of architects committed to making a difference. As I turned the first ceremonial shovelful of earth for the Resilience Center, I felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a fulfillment, of promises kept, of potential realized, of purpose sustained beyond individual lives or careers. Later, watching the actual construction equipment begin site preparation, James joined me at the perimeter of what would become the center's community garden space. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, wrapping an arm around my shoulders against the autumn chill. I leaned into his warmth, considering how to express the complexity of emotions the day had evoked. "I was thinking about buildings," I said finally. "How they outlast us, how they continue serving communities long after the architects and builders are gone." He nodded, understanding. "The ultimate legacy." "Yes, but not in the way I once thought. Not about having your name on the cornerstone or in the history books." I gestured toward the site where our design would gradually take physical form. "It's about what happens inside these spaces after we're gone. The lives lived, the communities strengthened, the problems solved." James smiled, recognizing the philosophical turn my mind had taken. "Architecture as service rather than monument." "Exactly." I turned to face him fully. I spent years fighting to preserve my father's company, to protect his vision, but I think I finally understand that the true preservation was never about keeping things the same. It was about ensuring the core purpose continued while allowing everything else to evolve. As we walked back toward the celebration tent where Linda's retirement party continued, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from that shocking moment of demotion to this day of groundbreaking and transition hadn't been easy or straightforward. It had required confronting betrayal, reclaiming power, rebuilding trust, and ultimately finding a new vision that honored the past while embracing the future. The company that bore my family name had nearly been stolen from me by the man who had vowed to be my partner in life. Instead, that attempted theft had become the catalyst for creating something stronger, more resilient, more truly aligned with the values that mattered most. What Mike had intended as my diminishment had ultimately led to my most profound growth. As I rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and sharing memories with colleagues new and old, I realized that the true ownership of Williams and Mitchell wasn't measured in stock percentages or legal documents. It resided in commitment to purpose, in daily choices aligned with values, in the courage to stand firm when easier paths appeared. My father had known this truth when he quietly transferred majority shares to me before his death. The legal ownership had given me the power to reclaim the company, but the moral ownership, the deep understanding of what made Williams and Mitchell worth fighting for, had been his true legacy. In the end, the secretary's desk that Mike had intended as my humiliation had become instead the vantage point from which I'd seen everything clearly for the first time. From that painful revelation had come the strength to rebuild not just a company, but a life of authenticity, purpose, and genuine partnership. As the celebration wound down and guests departed, I took one last look at the construction site, at the future taking shape before my eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to express the values that had guided us from the beginning. I was ready for all of it, grateful for the journey that had brought me here and the vision that would carry us forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.